Hello, Garland Nixon here with the one and only Scott Ritter. There's a lot of things we need to talk about on May Day. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon, and here with Scott Ritter. It happens to be my birthday, which is also May Day. And might I add, a lot of people know we do. I did a lot of search and rescue on the Chesapeake Bay for years. And when I was training a cadet on a training mission, I had the occasion to be on a boat in extremely heavy weather, and I knew I was in trouble when the guy who was running I'm traded picks up the boat and says, "Mayday, we're going down." And I thought, hey, that's a bad sign on a training mission. Luckily, we didn't exactly go down, but things didn't work out in the way that we would have liked to have them work out. But I'm here. All right. Just trust me. If you're on a boat training and the guy next to you who's in charge picks up the mic and starts yelling, "Mayday, we're going down," it's not a good training day.
It becomes real very quick.
Yeah. Hey, I don't think this is part of the training.
It was interesting. I went to Aerial Observer School, which is an old MOS. They don't use it anymore, but basically the idea was to take intelligence officers or artillery officers and train them to fly in the back seats of OV-10s or to fly in the co-pilot seat on Hueys. And your job was to do reconnaissance and to serve as a fire support coordinator. So you would adjust artillery, you would bring in airstrikes, you would coordinate it all. It was a pretty cool job, a lot of fun. But in the training, you have to get familiar and checked out in every aircraft that you could possibly be called upon to serve in. And one of them was the Huey, the old UH-1 Huey. And one of the things they train you on is if you have engine failure, you have to auto rotate in. And so there's the whole auto rotation. So to practice it, they would disengage the engine so that the rotor would free, but the engine's still powered. So in the end, you could power up and get the hell out of Dodge. But the idea was to get a feel for descent, and then so it wouldn't be the first. So we're going up on our auto rotation day, meaning I've never done it. I'm just sitting in there, and all of a sudden, we got engine failure. It's real. We're going down. And it's like, well, you're going to have to remember all the things we taught you in the classroom. Yeah, it's time to do them because this is as real as it gets. And fortunately, they taught me well. And it was a matter of checklists. And the pilot was really good. And we landed in the field and it wasn't a big deal. But as you said, if you're on a training mission, they go, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday." You're like, well, this ain't training anymore, is it? It's real.
Was that the bell? The Hughes. Is that the little bubbly one with the glass all over it?
That's an Army one. They call that the OH-6, the Little Bird, or right. MH-6, or whatever number they want to put on it. The Huey is the old UH-1 in November with 2 engines, naval. But it's the one. If you've seen the movie, we were warriors once and young. Mel Gibson, about Drang Valley and all that. And when they converted the 2nd Infantry Division into they made it the 1st Cavalry Division, Air Cav, and they brought in the Hueys. The Hueys were the mainstay of that, and the Hueys have been around forever. But this was in 1986, and even then the Huey was just old. I mean, you jumped in a Huey and then, what's that smell? That's the leaking fuel, the leaking oil, the leaking hydraulics. Everything leaks.
Yeah, we had the bubbly one. We had three of them. I had an aviation underway for a while. We had 3 of them. One of them flew. The other one, they took parts off all the time to keep the other one flying.
Yeah,
it was so old. Yeah, because you couldn't find parts for it. They were on the phone looking for parts, yanking parts. We had that and a Bell Jet Ranger that we used to fly in all the time. Anyway, let's get to the important stuff. We talked about this a little more, but having had a few days to contemplate, to think about this, the North Korea alliance, man, it hit me when when the Russians first came, and I realized it was a chess move, right? But a powerful chess move. But the more I think about it, I'm like, man, that changes the military dynamics worldwide, because now the Russian military, you could make an argument in a way. I mean, there's various ways of it. Certainly, there's mutual, gain. That the Russians now have a gigantic, extremely powerful military base with a huge army in Asia, like an extension. They had, the Volgograd region. They have, of course, an extensive naval presence in their Pacific Fleet. Now they got this giant nuclear-powered military, nuclear-armed military bases, and of course, it changes. Donald Trump says now he wants to talk with North Korea. Man, he's got a way different conversation than he had before. It changes the military stance. I don't know if that's the right word. Worldwide. Anyway, your thoughts?
I don't disagree with you, but the thing is, I think you're coming at it from an American perspective, meaning how we would view such an arrangement. The Russians have their own unique perspective. They've actually been far better at implementing George Washington's edict of avoiding entangling alliances than we have. And Russia doesn't get into entangling alliances, which is what makes this North Korea alliance unique and special. But a key aspect to it is the notion of sovereignty. Meaning that this isn't how America would treat it. For instance, we treat NATO as an extension of our foreign policy, an extension of our national security policy, which is why we promote NATO intervening in nations, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Serbia. We encourage this because it's an extension of what we want to accomplish. The Russians, if in reading the agreement they have with North Korea, the key thing here is that the military alliance doesn't get triggered unless the other state is attacked, meaning that it is singularly defensive in nature, that the North Koreans aren't an extension of Russia's military capacity, meaning that Russia gets to go, okay, North Korea, now we want you to attack Japan, or we want you to do this. That's not how the Russians are configured. That's not how they think. That's not how their diplomacy works. And I don't think North Korea would go along with that either. Just like, the idea that North Korea would say, all right, we got Russia on our, hey, Russia, Poland signed a deal with the South Koreans we're unhappy with. Go ahead and bomb them. And the Russians would be like, pound sand, we're not bombing them. So it's purely defensive in nature. What happened is, you notice the North Koreans didn't send troops into the disputed territories,
right,
into Novorossiya and everything. That doesn't mean that North Korea hasn't played a role. We know that North Korea has provided artillery systems and things of that nature, weapons, ammunition, and such. But the dispatch of organized North Korean military formations only took place in the context of the NATO invasion of Russia. And I call it the NATO invasion of Russia because it was. I had an interesting interview with Abdi Alaudinov. I always pronounce his name wrong. He corrected me on air, so I have to do my best. I have to do better. Sorry, Abdi. I'm an American. I fumble everything. Can't even pronounce my own name. But he I fumbled his name and I erased my mind.
We were talking about North Korea, and you
North
were talking
Korea,
about
but
Russian Sea.
I was talking to Opti about something. Now I know what I was talking about. He says that the evidence that they've collected from, captured equipment, prisoner of war interrogations, other intelligence, this incursion into Kursk was planned by NATO. This was a NATO plan. They planned it. The evidence is that they planned this in Germany. They rehearsed it in Germany. They used it. They issued advanced communications equipment, primarily similar to like little a field computer like a iPad that
Mhm.
got issued down to the small unit level where intelligence would be fed in. NATO tested out a new artificial intelligence operation scheme, meaning you plug in the intelligence and what you anticipate, and you maneuver based upon what AI says the enemy is going to do. So even if you have an incomplete intelligence picture, AI predicts a gap here, and so you push forward aggressively to shoot that gap. This was a NATO invasion of Russia, which is why the Russians turned to North Koreans and said, "We think maybe this and I think it was the North Koreans who went, hey, tugging on your, we think this triggers that. We'd like to
Yeah.
come in and help you."
Yeah.
The Russians are like, "Sure, come on in," because it makes sense. First of all, it solidifies this agreement, and as you've pointed out, this changes the geopolitical dynamic in the Pacific and around the world overnight. It allows North Koreans to get blooded, and I don't mean that. I mean, I'm not trying to say human life is not valuable. Of course, it's valuable, and nobody wants anybody to die except Banderists. But the North Koreans, if you're a military, you can train all you want, but until you actually get that combat experience, you don't know how your troops are going to perform under stress, and you don't know how your tactics and your operations, your whole methodology will survive when confronted with a real enemy. So the North Koreans were very anxious to come in and go toe-to-toe with NATO, which means you're going toe-to-toe with the United States. You're going toe-to-toe with Western military thinking, which the same principles that applied in Ukraine are being taught to the South Koreans and being used by the South Koreans. So North Korea came in and got invaluable experience on how to close with and destroy the Western enemy through firepower maneuver. This was a big deal, but it was defensive in nature. North Korea was responding. I would be shocked, and I just don't see it happening, to have North Korea get involved in the Novorossiya fighting, the fighting over that, because that's more controversial. That's North Korea not defending Russia, but North Korea participating in, regardless of how Russia frames it, it's not your classic self-defense. Russia has articulated collective self-defense, but North Korea is not part of that collective security arrangement that existed. And so
I would put it like this: there's more of a political aspect to that. In Kursk, there was a military aspect. You invade me, I fight on my in Ukraine, there's more of a political, controversial, if that's the word, discussion, international law, political aspect that is more touchy, I think.
Yeah, no, this is, you're 100% correct. There's it's pure. What the North Koreans did is pure. And it's funny because you and I have been talking about this for some time now, and you've been quite forward thinking, because you would pick up on the joint training that would take place between Russia and China, and you're saying now they're flying joint missions together, etc. And think about that. The thinking behind that, where you're saying, okay, they're together, which ties them together, so that the West needs to think twice about, if we're going to have a war with China over Taiwan, is it just going to be China? I think the whole North Korean experiences lends itself to justifying an assessment that says there's no such thing as isolating somebody in the Pacific anymore. You don't get to call out North Korea and deal with them in isolation. You don't get to isolate China on Taiwan. If you go to Taiwan, Russia's coming in. If Russia comes in, North Korea is coming in. If you go against North Korea, Russia's coming in, then China comes in. This is disruptive. And the Chinese, again, like Russia, aren't inclined to be involved in entangling alliances of this nature. But the Chinese are reading the tea leaves properly. The United States is trying to create, whether it's through the Quad, that relationship with Japan, India, and Australia, that's quasi-military in nature, whether it's AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, United States coming in, whether it's this, tripartite alliance with South Korea, Japan, the United States. Now the United States is trying to take the Quad, modify it, and turn it into something that has the Philippines and other nations involved. But the bottom line is the United States is literally building or seeking to build a wall of militarized containment around China and North Korea, and to some extent Russia. And the thinking in that is that you could isolate these three countries. I think that's no longer the case. I think you picked up on it a long time ago, and I think we're seeing it manifested today. The Russia, Chinese, North Korean, we can't call it an alliance, but it's the next best thing. Whatever term they want to use, the relationship, the self-defense fraternity, it's a game changer because we could come up with a concept of how we could isolate people and bring in sufficient military force to pick on North Korea or to pick on China. We can't pick on all three simultaneously. We don't have the military capacity. So this is very disruptive to Trump's vision, because Trump's strategic vision for foreign policy is to disentangle himself from Europe, disentangle himself from the Middle East, and focus the majority of America's power projection into the Pacific. This complicates that tremendously.
Something else it demonstrates why a lot of the neocons wanted to go after Russia, and they felt that Russia was the key. And people have been saying, so many people have been saying for years that huge Eurasian landmass, another way of saying Russia, is the key to running the world. But why? Russia is a dominant power on the the eastern front, the eastern European border, right? It's a very dominant power. It's been attacked, and they all know if you go into Russia, you're going to get beat. They can't seem to figure that out. Every 100 years or so, they forget, but they get a stark reminder every so often, and apparently they need it. But here's the other thing about Russia. It has a Pacific coast. It has a Pacific front. It has a Pacific fleet, right? So the thing about Russia is you've got the European front, that it's very powerful and dominant. Now it has a Pacific fleet, which I guess maybe Russia might have thought. If I'm Russia, I think if they were going to hit me, what they'd want to do is take China out so they could come in from the Pacific, because that's not as strong. It's more sparsely populated, etc. And it's a way of Russia really strengthening up their Pacific border, their Pacific front. But the other thing is, and I think about this, Scott, recently Russia said, this, because a lot of people were like, well, what are they trying to do? Are they trying to wall us off with these tariffs so they can go to war with China? And Russia said, we're concerned that this tariff war could turn into a hot war. I think all of these things are connected. I think it has to do with Russia strengthening up its Pacific border. I think it has to do with Russia looking up, saying, you know what, if this thing could be turning into a hot war soon, not that the Russians are like, let's get into the fight, but they're really brilliant tacticians and strategists. And I think it's them saying, man, we're afraid this could turn into a hot war. If we do this, it's going to make it a whole. If they were about to say, all right, let's fight China. Oh, crap. Maybe that's a bad idea. It's putting up a wall. It's saying you want to think twice before you do that. And if you are a military strategist and you're like, yeah, let's plan to go after China and we'll hit North Korea with this and we'll do this, you're suddenly thinking, oh man, we got to go back to drawing board, guys. This doesn't look good. And I think it's a strategic. That's why I keep saying it's a chess play. And I do connect it to them, their concern, their loud concern, because they didn't just like inside the halls of the Kremlin say we're afraid. They put it out there in all the Russian media. We're concerned this could turn into a hot war. Then wham, this happens, and it throws the kibosh, I think. It's their way of saying we're going to stop this hot war if we can.
Yeah, and it just related to that stream of thought there, which I agree with. The Russians are very sophisticated players, as you said. They aren't European centric. They are focused on the world, and they're very focused on the Pacific. The second largest economic forum that Russia runs is the one in Vladivostok, and it's huge. The Chinese are very big, very involved in that. So are Japanese and others. But Russia is very much focused on the Pacific. And first of all, I just want to remind people, just studying history, ask the Japanese about Kokengo, 1939, what it was like to go up against the Russians. They got their butts kicked. Ask the Japanese what happened in August and September of 1945, when the Russians rolled in and took out 1 million of them in a month. So, the Russians, they got a Far East presence that's pretty robust. Russia right now, is primarily focused on Ukraine, and there's concerns in Russia that Ukraine is a sort of a sump that's absorbing Russia's wealth and military and focus to the detriment. I mean, there's some case for that. When you take a look at the some of these units that are becoming known because of the fighting, I think the 155th Brigade is a Marine unit. They call it the Far East Marines. They come from that area. There are units that are normally associated with the Far East Military District that are now fighting in Ukraine, and so this is an issue. The Russians would like to bring this conflict to an end because it allows them to have stability. But if you take a look at, we might talk about this later, I don't want to get into too much detail, but this minerals deal, which isn't a minerals deal, it's a ridiculous cockamamie scheme to defraud many people. But this was, the Trump administration sees this as the thing. We get this, and now the Russians have no choice but to make peace. And the Russians are like, none of that happens until this conflict ends, and the Ukrainians aren't going to accept our terms, so none of this is going to happen. So it doesn't matter anyways. And the Trump administration once again has boxed themselves into a corner through very narrow-minded thinking. But the thing is, there will not be a peace deal in Ukraine. That's where I'm at right now. There will not be a peace. The Trump administration is incapable of doing what's necessary to bring about peace in Ukraine. It's because the peace in Ukraine will not be at the detriment of Russia. It just isn't going to happen. And you can't have your Secretary of State acknowledge that the Ukraine conflict is a proxy war between the United States and Russia, with Ukraine as the proxy, acknowledge this, understanding the role that NATO expansion played in this, which the United States has acknowledged, and then turn around and say, yeah, but Europe and Ukraine get what they want out of this. No, they don't. And Russia's not going to give it to them. So this is going to flop. But Russia's never put all their eggs in. That's why the majority of the negotiations between Witkoff and Putin and Kirill Dmitriev have been about the normalization of relations. But now this is where this comes in, because the normalization of relations, again, they have a very immature point. They believe that by normalizing relations, they checkmate Russia into Europe and weaken Russia in the Pacific. Therefore, Russia will be looking to the United States in the Pacific for assistance against China. And that literally, if you listen to, the comments made by Trump administration officials, they honestly believe by making good with Russia that they can drive a wedge between Russia and China. Well, that ain't going to happen either. The last time I checked, it was Xi Jinping who's coming to Moscow on May 9th. I don't know if you saw it. There's Chinese troops parading in Moscow in rehearsal for their participation in the May 9th parade. I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't a battalion of combat clothed North Koreans going to be marching in that baby, too.
I would bet there is.
But
here's something I got to throw at you. The Chinese, now there's a little history to it, but the Chinese have already marched into North Korea and fought on behalf of the North Koreans. So now you have Russia and China, where China historically said, you go too far in North Korea, we're fighting. In Korea, we're fighting. So they came in and fought. And now you have the North Koreans in Russia fighting an invasion into Russia. You're starting to get this line where, well, they fought on behalf of us. Well, we fought on behalf of them. That it's like, if you look at it, you're saying, well, you attacked them. Everybody in the room has literally fought on behalf of the other guys. And North Korea is the linchpin. China came in there and fought. They went over to Russia and fought. There's a linchpin between the two of them where they didn't have to scream, we have a military alliance with China.
Yep.
But there's a symbolism there from North Korea that is, to me, a symbolic military alliance with China. You know, you could at least interpret things that way.
Well, it's more than symbolic though, because you know you've mentioned the joint flights that are taking place.
Yeah.
We've had a, I won't call it a squadron, but a flight of bombers, Russian and Chinese together, making the run at Alaska. Which they tend to do just because we do the same thing to them.
Right.
Nobody talks about it, but we fly B-52 bombers on a strike mission profile against Russia, on a weekly basis,
Right.
Simulating nuclear cruise missile launch. Very dangerous thing. So the Russians, do that too, just to say, hey, we're here. But the Chinese now are participating in that as well. But what people don't focus on is that I guess it's Inner Mongolia, the Chinese have built this gigantic training facility. I mean, it is sort of like the National Training Center that the U.S. Army runs in Fort Irwin, or like the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center in 29 Palms. Live fire, maneuver, the whole thing. And they've been up there practicing, Army level maneuvering, where they get an army up there and it's doing its stuff. But they train down, to the tactical level. I mean, the platoons are assaulting platoon-sized positions in support of a company operation, in support of a battalion operation, in support of a regiment, in support of a division, in support of a corps, in support of the army. They're doing large-scale stuff. For the past several years, Russia has been sending officers to this and integrating with the Chinese, developing joint operational procedures so that Russian officers now can be plugged in and plugged out of Chinese units, and Chinese officers can be plugged in and plugged out of Russian units, so that if ever called upon to fight, and the Russians have sent some military units too, it's like NATO. You know how NATO has interoperability, commonality of logistics, etc. The Russians and the Chinese have been quietly building this commonality. And I would say that what North Korea started to do in the Kursk region was developing that commonality as well. So we are talking about militaries that, aren't just going to theoretically fight side by side at some point. They are trained to fight side by side and have on occasion fought side by side. Yes, we can talk about the Korean War and China coming in, but man, ain't too many people alive today that served back then, and the lessons they learned today aren't comparable. If you don't update the precedent, it's just history. It's not viable. They're updating it today. The Russians and the Chinese are as thoroughly integrated operationally as they're far more integrated operationally than the West believes. So I think that we're looking at something that's quite serious. It's not just the joint air patrols. We're talking about integrated, large-scale ground combat operations.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this is very, very powerful. And it gives all parties involved significantly more leverage in negotiation, bottom line. And the other part of it is this. If you want to go talk, we're already seeing that to discuss with Iran is you got to some extent, you got to talk with the Russians, because you have to be concerned. Are you starting World War III? What are the Russians going to do? What have you? There's Russians in there. They're bringing in all kinds of war material. How prickly is Iran if somebody wanted to attack it? So you can't talk. So now, if you're talking North Korea or you're talking Iran, you have to have some level of discussions with the Russians. You know what I mean? So we're creating, what's interesting is the Russians and the Chinese have continuously said, we don't want a block. We don't want a specifically named Warsaw Pact versus NATO, because that kind of leads to conflict. So what they're doing is creating something that's not a block per se. It's not a formal military block, but it's an alliance. And the other thing that's clear is BRICS is really becoming powerful, and BRICS is going to be a vehicle economically to develop North Korea, that BRICS is becoming something more than just an economic bloc. And I'm not going to call it an economic bloc or a military bloc. It is a geopolitical bloc. You know what I mean? It's becoming an all-encompassing bloc that has a significant amount of missions. Because they were like, is it a military bloc? Is it? I think initially it was an economic bloc, but it's becoming something much broader than that.
You know, the Russians and the Chinese, if you go back to February 4th, I believe it was 2022, when Putin flew to Beijing prior to the opening of the Beijing Winter Olympics, he and Xi Jinping met, and they issued a 5,000-word joint statement. And that statement is interesting because it basically declared war against the rules-based international order, saying we reject it and we're going to replace it with a law-based international order. At that time, they said we don't know what the exact vehicle for confronting the rules-based international order. Will it be BRICS? Because BRICS at that time was still undeveloped. Will it be the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Will it be the G20? Or something else, the European Economic Union? We don't know, but it's going to be something. But what was interesting is the Chinese and the Russians, when they talked about this agreement, they said it's not an alliance. It's stronger than an alliance. And here's the interesting thing. See, we in the West keep looking for a piece of paper that defines obligations. You know, look at NATO. We went Article 5. Attack against one is an attack against all. You know, we have obligations. We have this, that, and the other thing. And so you have four corners of an agreement that lock you in.
Mm-hmm.
And what the Russians and Chinese said is, we have no limits. See, you guys are looking at it saying, oh, you haven't defined what it is, so you've got nothing. And the Russians and Chinese went, no, we don't have any limits. That's what makes this better, because the sky is the limit. It's whatever we want it to be. And we in the West analytically don't know how to deal with that. We're trying to quantify what it is. What's this relationship between Russia and China, which in many ways contributes to the fact that we still think that we can split Russia and China apart, because after all, they don't have a formal defense alliance. You know, well, they got something better than that. They've got something with no constraints, and it gives them tremendous flexibility now. The other thing it does is it doesn't create, when you have obligations, those obligations can be used against you, because now I can look at things and say, oh, I'm going to pick on this one and drive a wedge between the Russians and the Chinese. Whereas now the Russians and Chinese are going, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, we don't agree on that. We don't agree on that, but that's okay. We agree on all this other stuff. We'll deal with that. But they're not going to let that be used to split them apart, because there's no obligations. There's no expectations. It is what it is. I think, and we in the West can't handle that kind of thinking. But that's where the Russians and the Chinese are today. This arrangement without limitation.
Well, that's very Confucian. That's very Eastern philosophy. And I tell you why. As a guy who studies Zen, there's a saying in Zen: it's the space between the bars that keeps the tiger in the cage, right? You could look at it and say, well, it's the cage that keeps him in. No, if the space was too far apart, he could walk right through. As long as it's close enough, he can't get through. So it's really the space that keeps him, right? Bottom line is, if I write down, if you do this to Scott, then I'll do that, then I'm restricted. You can say, I'll do everything else but that.
Right.
But if I just say, Scott and I have an alliance, what is it? There's no limits to our alliance.
Yeah. We have an arrangement.
Right. If you say, well, I'm going to threaten Scott, I may punch you. You may shoot Scott. I may do nothing. You have no idea what I'm going to do, because there's no space to stop me from acting. You can't look at it and say, well, let's read this and let's bring in our experts and figure out what their document says, what their alliance, how far. Because, the U.S. likes to do that. The salami slice it. Let's step right up to the edge of what they're, and then we'll, drive them crazy and we'll poke them. Like little kids in the back of the car, don't touch me. And the kid goes, I'm not touching you. She got her hands up. That's what they like to do. So I think that is, it's really a brilliant strategy. Did you see any of the Lavrov interview on CBS?
Oh yeah.
What'd you think of the Lavrov's such a brilliant guy? Let me just add this. If you listen to him and Maria Zakharova, or whatever her name is, who I think is a very pretty woman, but if you listen to them, the Russians have a dry sense of humor that nobody else has that. So you got to really appreciate it. And Lavrov is like the master of it. But what were your thought on, they tried everything they could to box him in, to shove him into a corner. And man, he's masterful. Your thoughts on the CBS interview with, I think it was CBS, wasn't it?
Well, first of all, let's just talk about the two approaches. The United States, we're not reality based. I mean, this goes back to the thinking. If you remember when George W. Bush came in, and the arrogance of that administration, we create our own reality. Do you remember that statement?
Mm-hmm.
We create our own reality. We have the resources together that don't tell me what reality is. We're going to come in with money, power, and we're going to create our own reality, which means you're no longer a prisoner in their thinking to history, to facts. You just create what you want. And then what happens is when you don't have the ability to make that reality genuinely real, you spin it. You live in the United States has lived in a fantasy world of its own creation where we have spun everything. And we believe because we say something, therefore it is. And then we expect everybody to act on this because we've said it is, therefore it is, because we create our own reality. And this perversion of intellectualism has worked its way down into the media, into academia, into every aspect of how America interfaces with the world. It is literally a fiction-based fantasy that we live in. Russia, on the other hand, lives in a world defined by fact-based intellectual discipline. Whether it's their historians, and I've had several in the Russia House, I've had several fascinating discussions with Russian historians, and the discipline and the rigor of thought that goes into their collection of facts, their assessment of facts, and drawing conclusions from these facts is very strict. Russian diplomats live in the real world. They haven't spun jack squat, meaning that, because, one of the dangers that you've always heard this, don't tell any lies and you don't have to worry about telling any story.
Yeah.
Because you're just telling the truth. But once you start lying, you got to go, oh God, where did I lie? Is that the truth or is that,
a liar better have a good memory, right?
Lies.
Yeah.
Russia doesn't tell any lies. So this interviewer kept trying to throw the distortions, the lies, the spin of the West at Lavrov. And he's just like, but that ain't true. This is the truth. And the difference is, see, she doesn't know the difference. She's sitting there throwing things, thinking they're true, but knowing they're not true. But she doesn't know the difference of the accuracy of anything she's saying. Lavrov is 100% absolute sure about everything he says. That's why he and Maria Zakharova, I mean, first of all, they're very smart to begin with. I mean, we have to give them that. But two, when you combine, intelligence with integrity, you become unbeatable. This is why he's unbeatable. This is why he's so relaxed, because you can't catch him off guard because he's not spinning anything. He's just throwing the facts out there. And that's the way it is. And you can't and she just couldn't get any traction. And he kept, deflecting her. But this is the fact of, the reality is that the Russians are fact-based and we're fiction-based. And that's why he ends up wiping the floor, not just with her, but with everybody. If you try to play cute with these people and start spinning things, they cut right through the spin. They get to the heart of the matter, and that's the end of the discussion.
I'll say one other thing. It's people like us that created that interview. Let me tell you why. I thought about this. Number one, they would never interview a Russian anything. Lavrov, Putin, none of that wouldn't happen in mainstream media here. And if they did, they just attack them far more than they did, right? Tucker Carlson opened the door when he interviewed Vladimir Putin. You've interviewed Maria Zakharova. I always screw her name up, whatever it is. My American version, the pretty blonde-haired lady. The pretty
smart blonde-haired lady. We have to credit her with being smart.
Exactly. Yeah, smart and pretty. Anyway, but now Larry Johnson and those guys, they go talk to Lavrov, right? What's happening now is the mainstream media is screwed because everybody's watching alternative media. I guarantee the Trump people, they've got to. The intelligence community has to watch alternative media. So everybody's watching alternative media. And now, and this is, again, the brilliance of Putin and Lavrov. These are two of the top statesmen in the world. And what do? They went to alternative media in the United States. When mainstream media in the West wouldn't touch them, they went to alternative. Tucker Carlson, yes, I'd love to. Larry Johnson, you guys, you want to come to? Oh, are you kidding me? There's nothing I'd like better than to come talk to Sergei Lavrov. The Russians forced the Western media to do that. I think it was, you know what I mean? It was brilliant the way they did it. And having alternative media doing this stuff, now the Western media is afraid. And I believe you'll see it more. I mean, maybe the Chinese, maybe other, I think you'll see other countries start saying, man, the door into Western media and to get a semi-fair interview where they don't just attack you is to go through alternative media first. It's forcing their hands. What do you think, Scott?
No, I mean, we've been saying this for some time now that we have supplanted. I mean, we're not there yet. It's not 100%, but what we did last fall, and Garland, you were an important part of this. We helped stop a nuclear war. I mean, we really did. We made it an issue. We worked together collaboratively to take advantage of the size and the scope of our respective audiences to inject a way of thinking. We did the indirect approach. I mean, I was heavily criticized when I interviewed RFK Jr. on my show. Heavily criticized. But what I kept telling people is that, of course, RFK and I don't agree on Israel. I made it clear. I've written articles about it. We don't agree. Right. And we don't agree on everything. But what we did do is create an engagement, a dialogue. And you know what happened in that dialogue? The phone never stopped ringing. RFK Jr. would call me up and ask questions. A lot of his questions were about Russia and about Ukraine. And he asked probing questions. And then most importantly, he listened and they asked follow-up questions. And then he went off and did his thing. Now, I could have been, well, screw you, RFK. Your stance on Israel sucks. I'm not talking to you at all. I disagree with you so much. You're an evil person. You're a bad person. Everything all the mob, the digital mob does. But what I did is say, we disagree on Israel. But we have so much in common, and you're a person of influence. I understood the potential of RFK Jr. In the domestic political scene. And when he unplugged from his own presidential campaign and plugged into the Trump campaign, it was a game changer. It helped win the election for Donald Trump. When he and Tulsi Gabbard came over, they brought in a whole bunch of people and it helped tip the scales. But what it also did is all that work I did in talking to him and such, he's now on the inside. And without going into too much detail, an op-ed piece appeared that was heavily influenced by our interaction, written by him and Donald Trump Jr., the president's son. If you don't think that Jr. is acting with the knowledge and consent of the father, you don't know anything. And they wrote an op-ed piece, published in The Hill, that embraced exactly what we were trying to accomplish. They injected our thinking into the mainstream of a presidential campaign, and then we were able to build upon that and have indirect influence over policy decisions that stopped a nuclear war. So this is pretty cool stuff. We have this potential, but one of the things that we have to always be guarded upon is we have to police ourselves. See, this isn't like the mainstream media where you have producers and executives and all that. We're responsible for our own content and our own. So we have to police ourselves. We've done a good job, and I think we collectively have great credibility. And when we put our minds together, we can tip the scales, which is very important. But not all social media is like that. And there are a lot of freelancers out there. And some people would say, well, Scott, you're not perfect. No, I'm not. Scott, you've made mistakes. Yep. Okay. Garland, shame on you. Well, yeah. Okay. Wow. That one time Garland said something that wasn't quite, Jesus-like in its predictions. Garland's a human being. So is Wilmer Leon. So is Judge Napolitanos. We're all human beings, but we mean well, and we're trying to do the right thing, which is important. You have people out there who aren't trying to do the right thing. The power of the interviews that you speak of are absolute. What about Ben Shapiro, though, going over and talking to Zelensky? I mean, that was just that's not a legitimate interview. He went over there with an agenda, and his job was to create a counter narrative to what we're doing. Lex Freeman, is that the guy's name?
Yeah.
Same thing. I mean, so we have to be careful about giving all of social media, an applause, because social media still needs to be policed, and the best policing comes from us who police ourselves, but the second best policing comes from our audience. The beauty of social media is that they can hit the off switch and stop watching you. You know how you always say, click those likes, or hit those likes, click these things, do this, do that, because it affects an algorithm. There is I haven't figured it out yet, which is probably why my show continues to, hang out down here while yours is bursting through the atmosphere. But, there's an algorithm out there that is predicated upon the relationship we have with our audiences and how they interact with us to create certain stimulus that increases, visibility. Okay, but that's the game. I mean, that's the modern day version of, advertising dollars or something like that. As long as we don't fall into the trap of clickbait, of being irresponsible, of being frivolous, as long as the audience is a serious audience, sincerely focused on learning, empowering themselves with knowledge and information, we can purge out this other stuff, and we can create a really good product that is so much stronger than anything the mainstream media can do. I have to tell you, if let's say I ever got an invitation to go to Russia and interview Vladimir Putin, I'd be more nervous about how I would be received by our social media audience because of expectations than I would be about how I would actually interface with Vladimir Putin, because we have a serious audience. We have a very serious audience that's very knowledgeable of these issues, and they don't tolerate BS. They don't tolerate deviation from fact. I have a dog right now that's just calling me out on my BS, apparently. But my point is, we're on to something big here, Garland. We're on to something really good that is going to, and has already changed the way America thinks. Social media, alternative media, the independent journalists, we're the shot callers now. Maybe not individually. I mean, Tucker Carlson has that audience where he's Joe Rogan has that kind of audience. But what we've done over the course of past years, we've created what we call the family of podcasts. And when you bring our family of podcasts together, we pack a punch, and it's pretty cool.
I never thought about that. You had people like me, Dima, Judge Napolitano, Larry Johnson over at Countercurrents. You got the on and on and on, and you start putting the people together, and man, you got way more views than CNN or MSNBC. They pale, our groups together, they pale in comparison to what we do.
We generate, when I was looking at what we're doing last year, we could generate 2.5 to 3 million views collectively in a week's time, which is pretty good. That's better than anything CNN does. So beating everything, Fox, CNN, beating all of them. Yeah. Particularly for one of they put something. I'm shocked. I'll see CBS or MSNBC or NBC put out a video, and it's like 23,000 views. I'm like, holy crap, I can get that. How did they get it? And they're getting billions from Pfizer and Lockheed Martin, very important. Where's my Pfizer money?
Yeah, exactly. Not happening, unfortunately. The things that we say, they don't pass. But the last thing I'd like to ask you about, there is something I'd like to ask you about before we go, and this is it. So just may seem out of the blue, but I just want to get your thoughts on it. Tucker Carlson accuses Ukrainians of trying to kill Trump, right? And he goes on to say that they're trying to kill him. He talks about Ruth. It's very obvious that the Ukrainians were involved in the attempted assassination in the golf course in Florida. Carlson said that guy definitely had some contact with Ukraine. I know for a fact that there were others who were a target of assassination attempts by the Ukrainian government, he claims, without providing details. You know, Tucker Carlson does not strike me as a guy who just make stuff up. I don't know. I met him before. He seemed like a nice guy, but I put it like this. I don't have the inside connections of Carlson. And I felt this way for quite a while. Do you have any thoughts at all on those comments by Tucker Carlson?
You know, I was hired about a decade ago by a very influential person. I write for Energy Intelligence, and Energy Intelligence is as serious and influential a media outlet, a publisher as one can imagine, because their audience are literally all of the major CEOs of all of the major oil companies in the world. Their annual conference is called the Oil and Money Conference because they bring together the people that control all the world's oil and all the world's money. So these are very serious people. And they have a very high standard. And what I brought to the table for them wasn't my ability to pick up the phone and contact the head of Chevron and get an inside story. You know, there's certain things when people retire from certain jobs, you get hired because they're bringing your Rolodex with you. I guess today we don't use Rolodexes anymore, but they're bringing your contacts. So the assumption is now that you're in this position, as things happen, you can reach back and make contact and bring that data forward. I don't have any of that. What I have, and this is what my boss there pointed out, is an ability to connect the dots. And I've been connecting the dots my entire life. And I have a really, really good track record of connecting the dots. And the reason why I wanted to say this is that when I take a look at Tucker's analysis, what I do when I see a story like that is I shed it of all the peripheral nonsense, and I just get down to the specific dots of fact that we're talking about. And when I connect those dots, I don't draw the same conclusion that Tucker Carlson draws, because this character was crazy. This character he was the one trying to force relationships. Relationships weren't being forced on him. In fact, as he forced relationships, the very people that you would want to be working with him if they were trying to target Trump were pushing back and saying, we don't want to work with this guy because he is crazier than a loon. And so I think what Tucker's guilty of here is connecting the dots in a very liberal manner to reach a conclusion that's already been reached. Meaning, I think Tucker came into this and said, I believe that Ukraine was trying to target President Trump. Therefore, ... This guy is working with Ukraine. When I connect the dots, I don't have any conclusions. I just put the dots together and say, where do they take me? And so I don't agree. I'm not saying that Ukraine doesn't have a plan out there. I'm not saying that that this could be something else. We don't know. The U.S. government hasn't released a totality. This guy had secure phones. We don't know all of the points of connectivity, but the data that is available to us does not, in my opinion, lend itself to a conclusion that Ukraine was directing this guy to kill Donald Trump. I think this guy was a crazy freelancer who was motivated by Ukraine to carry this action out. He was also as incompetent as the day is long, thank goodness, because has the Secret Service yet figured out that if there was an actual, Jason Bourne Ukrainian out there, that the president would be dead? I mean, haven't they figured out how did that guy get on the golf course with a long rifle? His incompetence in covering concealment is what saved the president. Had he taken a little bit more time to conceal this, he would have gotten a clean shot and the president would be dead. Which tells me again, he's just a loon doing his own thing. He didn't have an escape and evasion plan. He panicked, drove away. This is all the actions of a freelancer. But what scares me is that this freelancer got to the point where he could have killed the president of the United States, the president-elect at that time. That bothers me because there just seems to be this cavalier, the same thing with that kid getting on the roof in Butler, Pennsylvania. No one's explained to me how that happened yet. How did he fly a drone? How did he do all this? And no one's explained to me how this guy that got that close. I'm not worried about the Ukrainians, Garland. I'm worried about Americans. I'm worried about a cabal here that might be linked to the National Security Division of the FBI, which has been gunning for Trump since 2016 or even before. These are the people that set him up with Russiagate, with Christopher Steele, with the whole thing. The liars, all of them who view Trump as an existential threat to the United States of America. I'm worried about those people. And there's just not enough talk about that. I think this whole Ukraine thing's a distraction. I'm more concerned about what is on that phone isn't going to show that there's a connectivity to Ukraine. What's on that phone is going to show that there's connectivity inside the United States. Yeah.
It's funny you say that because when I looked at it as an old investigator, I looked at it in the same way. That's why I threw it at you, because I looked at it and I said, well, I can understand how you could be suspicious of that. Certainly. There's enough there. There's enough to have a hunch, shall we say, reasonable suspicion, which is no more than a hunch, right? But the meat's not there to say, okay, it really looks like what it is. Yeah, that's what it was. And so I think you're right. Yeah, when I look at it, I say, yeah, I can see where somebody could think of it. And if somebody in the chat says, no, I think it was Ukraine, I can understand why you could look in that direction.
Sure.
But I can't come to even close to a conclusion that that's what it is. And after Butler, I had tremendous suspicions about domestic intelligence. In Butler, I looked at it and I'm like, yeah, there's a level of incompetence, but there's some things here that are so weird.
There's other things going on, man.
I was involved in, I've done that before. Presidential security. I worked when actually Vice President Dick Cheney bought a house on the Eastern Shore. And it was, interestingly enough, it was the property where it was the former slave plantation that Frederick Douglass lived on the Eastern Shore, that was turned into this rich neighborhood. Rumsfeld, Cheney, all of these people all bought mansions. That's Talbot County, on the Eastern Shore. Everybody, the rich people, that's the showy off place to live. Bottom line is, I was part of the group working for the governor's office that put together the entire security plan for that. Wasn't nobody getting in it, man. Nobody was getting in that. They had guys in like eagles nest up by the trees, snipers, you name it. Boats cut off. You couldn't come in the creek when he was in there on the weekend. Wasn't happening. And I look at the level of security that I was involved in, and I was one of the people that go to the meetings, and when the Secret Service and these people say, we need your guys to do this, I said, yes, sir. My guys will be where you need them to be, right? But when I look at that level, that wasn't happening. And I think based on the abilities that I saw of these people to provide securities and to dot every I and cross every T, right? Sweep everything before he came, sweep everything when he got there, sweep everything so many hours, they sweep again. I'm like, based on what I saw, that couldn't happen. Somebody had this, hey, there's a guy out there on the roof. And it like everybody, hey, there's a guy on the roof with a gun. Let's look over here. Yeah, I'm with you, Scott. At any rate, Scott, go ahead. Did you have a list?
I was just going to say, when I was with the United Nations, the president would come every September for the General Assembly meeting. And, we were on the 31st floor of the Secretariat building, prime sniper position, by the way. Across from us is Tudor City, full of buildings. The Secret Service would come through there starting weeks in advance, doing the walkthroughs, and they'd have shadow teams. You'd have you have people in the Secretariat looking across to Tudor City, people in Tudor City looking across, getting all the angles, checking everything out. Nothing was left to chance. And I remember they told us, don't open the windows. And so, of course, what happens is, the presidential convoy is coming in and the president's coming out, and he comes around the loop and up comes the window so we can stick our head out and get a view. And immediately phone rings. Get your head back in the window. They watch everything.
Yes.
They had a team across there, and as soon as that window went up, there's a rifle right on me. And as soon as they realized I wasn't doing anything stupid, they said, okay, whatever communication plan you have in place for that sector, get that freaking idiot's head back in the window. And boom, head back in the window, shut. My point is, that's you, as you said, that's how it's supposed to work. How did this dude get on a roof? How did all this happen? How did the ladder get there? Something else is going on here that we're not being told.
Yeah, I'm with you there, Scott. ScottRitter.com. It's Scott's website. That's where everything's going. What's happening, Scott? What do people need to know? I know you've got the Russia House and you got a book being released. Before we go, let everybody know about your current projects.
Well, the big three is the Russia House. That continues to be an ongoing project. We had a fascinating interview with a Russian historian, and I think I talked to you before. We're focused on Stalin and the legacy of Stalin, the historical legacy of Stalin, and I think people are going to want to tune in on that because it impacts everything. The Russophobia that exists in the United States today is largely shaped by, a mental picture formed about Russia during Stalin times. For instance, one of the great influences is Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago. And I think Americans would be surprised to find out that it's a total work of fiction.
It says so right at the beginning of the book. I read it.
It's a total work. Well, it was sold to us as I have archives, I've interviewed people, I've done all this, but now, they have to admit he just sort of made it all up because it was a vision of what he wanted it to be to make a point, but it was just totally made up. But we deconstruct Robert Conquest's The Great Terror. We deconstruct, the Harvest of Sorrow, the Holodomor. We deconstruct, Meryl Feinsaud's how Russia is ruled. We deconstruct all of the myths about Stalin. So that's on the Russia House. The interview gets released today. So if you can subscribe, chock full of really good stuff. Apti Aladanov, Maria Zakharova, Oleg Artemyov, the cosmonaut. We had a wonderful interview with him. On and on. As you said, book Highway to Hell. It's coming out, and this is basically it creates or puts forward a narrative of the history of how we got from 2015 with the threat of nuclear war to today, where it's a real probability. And then the importance of arms control. And I talk about how arms control has devolved over time and why we need to bring it up. Highway to Hell, Clarity Press. It's out. You can get it in Clarity Press. You can pre-order it on Amazon. But the other interesting thing is we have a new program out called Trump Watch. It's a 1-hour program. If you're a subscriber to my Substack, a paid subscriber to my Substack, you will get access to Trump Watch. We're also going to put it out on X as an X subscription. So it's a subscription-based interview, but the idea, it's an hour-long program where we take an aspect of Trump's policies, and then I interview a person, a relevant expert on the issue, and we talk about what did Trump promise in the campaign, and has he acted on that promise? And he gets graded on that. Then the other one is, what are the effectiveness of this action? Okay, so he's taking action, but is it doing what he said he wants it to do? And then the third criterion is the constitutionality, is what Trump's doing based upon the Constitution. So I have a conversation with the expert. We grade this, and then I close off with the final question: Is Trump's policy making America great again? What is this policy doing to advance the interests of the United States? And I provide a grade. The first issue deals with, it's called Deportees, and it deals with the immigration issue. And my guest is Alan Dershowitz, not because of his stance on Israel. You remember that I talked about the conversation I had with RFK Jr. Dershowitz and I don't agree on Israel at all. Dershowitz was a Harvard law professor, one of the most noted minds in America about Constitution. And if you've been following him outside of the framework of Israel, he has spoken very intelligently about the clash between the executive and the judiciary on immigration issues. It's a fascinating conversation, and we'll be putting that out on Tuesday. So Trump Watch, Highway to Hell, The Russia House, and of course, Ask the Inspector. You can find it all on scottritter.com. One-stop shop. Thanks.
You know, the funny thing you say about that, and that is same with Dershowitz. There's a lot of things I got bad issues with Dershowitz, but you know, another thing he's done a lot of good work on, believe it or not, I think it's that wasn't he involved with the Innocence Project. People who were convicted of and sentenced to death, who they would find out they didn't do it. They do a lot of research to people.
The DNA evidence,
all kinds of evidence. Like, what was it in Illinois? They did this research into all of the, like 100 and some people on death row, and they found like 13 people that were completely innocent on death row, and they had to stop it. So for all, I'd like to strangle Dershowitz when it comes to some issues, but he's when it comes to other things, you know, you gotta give him credit.
And imagine you're the family of somebody on death row, and Alan Dershowitz is your only shot at getting your innocent relative off death row. Do you think that they're focused on Israel at the moment? Do you think they give a rat's ass that we disagree with Alan Dershowitz on? Do you think Israel factors into any of that? The reality is that most people live multifaceted lives, and it's complex, it's nuanced, and there's many things that I'm sure, Garland, even though I love you to death and we've sat down before and I can't find anything that I violently disagree. I think if we sat down long enough, we would find something that we're just like, nah, you do that, I do that. We don't, but we go, okay, that's cool. Then we get back to, you know, living life together. I'm not saying that people should, you know, cut Alan Dershowitz slack on Israel. No, he like everybody else should be held accountable for their point of view, just like I should be. You know, the entire pro-Israeli crowd rips me apart on a daily basis. That's okay. I'm held accountable. He's held accountable. But we live in a complex world, and where we can come together to push forward an agenda that is beneficial to people, we shouldn't allow. I mean, there are some extreme cases, and some people would say that genocide is such an extreme case. But, you know, I couldn't have picked a better person to introduce Trump's immigration policies to the American people than Alan Dershowitz. And I would hope that people would watch this show with that in mind, because if you watch this show, you're going to learn so much about the legal issues that encompass, and you'd be surprised to find out how he holds the Trump administration to account for their lack of compassion for the illegal immigrants, and where he stands on issues like free speech when it comes to immigration. A lot of assumptions are made, but when you have the actual opportunity to speak to somebody and dig deeper, you learn a lot more about the person. So anyways, he was our first guest. We're lining up guests for follow-on shows, but Trump Watch. I hope people tune in.
The most difficult interview I ever did was a guy named Kurt Bloodsworth. And I've had a lot of interviews where I've had trouble, and I'm sure you have, where you didn't want to tear up. You wanted to be a tough guy, you know, especially being an old ex-cop. You don't ever want to tear up, and you know, you try to pretend, but it can happen. But this guy, he got arrested for the rape and murder of a 10-year-old girl, and he didn't do it. And he was in jail for like 11 years.
And he didn't do it?
He didn't do it.
Oh.
He was just moved to the Baltimore area from the Eastern Shore. He got married at like 22. He had a nice young wife. He was starting off with his life. He was getting a job. One day, the police knock on his door. Boom, boom, boom. They take him away, and they say he raped and murdered a 10. He's like, what the hell are you talking about? Next thing you know, he's in court. They're finding him guilty, and the people in the courtroom are screaming, give him the gas chamber, give him the, right? And he's like, what the hell? He's in, and basically what happens is they end up, he was the first person to ever get off from DNA evidence. And at some point they came up with DNA, and his lawyer or somebody was talking to somebody saying, you know, what about the Kurt Bloodsworth case? Well, do we ever have the evidence? And they went and talked to the judge who was going to retire. The judge said, you know, I still got the evidence in a closet somewhere. And they went and got it, and they tested the DNA, and it wasn't him. And it was a guy who was in jail for the rape and murder of somebody else, who was like in the same jail that he was in, who at the time was in the area, and just and some people that even reported, yeah, I saw that guy in the area. So they really had the guy. And this guy's life was like totally, his wife left him. All the things, she went on, got married, and she said, well, I'm sorry when he gets out of jail, but I got married, got kids, I moved on. That was the love of his life. And he lost her 11 years, and they gave him like $800,000 or something for 11 years, and to hear that, and hear his story, that was the most crushing story I've ever had. So yeah, I'm real big on that. So, all right, Scott Ritter, thanks a lot. Everybody go to scottritter.com. Make sure you follow Scott on Telegram and everywhere else. And most importantly, everybody, share this on all your social media platforms. We're out.